Today we're going to talk Jamstack 2024. Just before we start, let's see if I can get this clicker to work. Okay, kind of. For those of you who might not know me, I'm Matt Biilmann. I'm CEO and co-founder of Netlify. Netlify started, we launched back in March 2015, a long time ago, and since then we've onboarded more than 4.5 million developers to our platform. We've raised 212 million from great partners, and we're serving more than 1 billion unique visitors to the site, stores, and apps running on our globally distributed edge network for customers across basically all industries, sectors, verticals, from hobby developers to things like Vodafone, Unilever, VF Corp, and so on. But I want to talk about the origin of the Jamstack and the future of the Jamstack. Almost about 8 years ago, around this time, I was speaking at a conference back in 2016. Very different landscape, very different environment in San Francisco at the Smashing conference in San Francisco on the new front-end stack. And that was the first time I introduced the term Jamstack to the world. The core principles back then, and these actual slides from the presentation eight years ago, was really this idea that as we started the web, this is the very first web page by Tim Berners-Lee, and it was like a very simple architecture, right? Like you would just fetch it from a server, and that's it. It would have hyperlinks that would take you to other servers. We sort of moved from that to this idea that instead of just fetching it from a server, there would be a program running every single time you visited that server. And then we extended that into the idea of database-driven websites that really allowed for e-commerce and the modern web as we know it, this whole idea that you would go to a program, it would talk a bunch to a database, and then send back some page specifically for you. Then as the web grew, we started to have to really figure out how do we actually scale this? How do we maintain performance and scalability? And we introduced all these layers of caching between the server and the program and the database. We started introducing CDNs at the first just mainly for assets and at really big companies, and now we had to sync between the program and the CDN. Then we had to start handling monitoring and cloud provisioning and fingerprinting and replication and all of that. And it all got pretty complicated, which showed up in terms of like lack of huge security problems, reliability issues, performance issues. Everybody back in 2016 would resonate with this slide. Maybe not as much today, but back then it was like you followed a link from Slashdot or Hacker News to a site, and you would often get this kind of problem. And it had really become an excuse for walled garden, like Facebook instant articles and Google AMP, or just mobile apps and application stores. In fact, when I was out fundraising for Netlify back in 2015, a common reason to not invest would be like, why are you focusing on the web? Isn't it all just going to be like mobile apps and social media? But we thought that in this context, there was a much better way of architecting for the web that would really help the web be the best platform it could be. This was at a time where, like, a very different time, right? Like where the standard way of starting a new project would probably look something like this, right? Like you would pick WordPress or Drupal, maybe a big Ruby on Rails application, or Magento for e-commerce, so that like the ecosystem around this different way of building was like very early stage. It was things like Jekyll or Hugo. It was built tools like Grunt and Gulp, and Contentful at the time had raised a seed round in Berlin. Prismic was just getting started, right? Like it was a very different landscape. But I saw the sort of unifying trend that we had to gather around in order to get to a better place around this idea of decoupling the front end from the back end, and really start splitting up the way we build the web UIs from the way we treat content management or e-commerce transactions or business logic and so on, and really remove the need from the business logic to dictate how we actually build the web experiences, right? Like with all of those previous platforms, you would be like, we pick WordPress as our CMS, and now our front-end developers had to work in PHP templates, right? Had to get away from that. So 8 years ago, I introduced this idea of the Jamstack, really centered around this idea of an emergent set of standards around the idea of build tools as part of your process, as Git as the way everybody would work with code and releases, of modern front-end frameworks as the piece you would actually use to build front-ends with, and then the reliance on well-defined APIs for all your data and business logic, and CDNs to be able to take this decoupled front end and put it really close to where your users are and make the web fast and reliable and scalable again. With the philosophy of decoupling building from the actual hosting, decoupling the front end from the actual back end, use APIs rather than databases directly, and pre-bake as much markup as you can and enhance it with JavaScript to go from this like very complicated operational system to an easier world where ideally you have your code in Git. When you make changes, you run a build, you put it directly on a global edge network, you talk to APIs at build time or at runtime. The decoupling was really at the heart of this. Ever since, there's been a lot of talks about what did Jamstack mean and where is it going and where is it now and so on. To me, this concept of decoupling was really the part that allowed us to set the front end free in a way and allow us to focus on the front end on its own. It was key to what allowed us to build Netlify as an integrated end-to-end platform for running your whole web platform, from connecting to your APIs and data services, to building and deploying your code, and to running all of the front-end relevant code on a global network or serverless functions. It was what allowed us to introduce this idea of deploy previews that we launched way back in 2016. This idea that every single pull request you open in GitHub or merge request you open in GitLab, whichever operation platform you use, should turn into a URL that you can instantly share with anyone, that runs in the same production infrastructure as your production environment, and essentially turn every pull request into a staging environment. And it was what allowed us to say, like, if you can decouple the front end from all the back-end logic and all the business logic and from your actual database, you can put it on a global network and you can scale infinitely and you can get much better performance, resiliency, and reliability. There's also the idea that if you do this, it should be so much simpler to run the web app locally, because it's no longer tied to databases and data migration and to your whole infrastructure, and really like push for this concept of your dev server that should be instant and live reloading and amazing to work with. Now, in the core of the original Jamstack, there was also really this idea of what can you pre-bake versus build on the fly. This was kind of the key of what gave us this concept of atomic deploys from the beginning. This idea that every time you make a change to your content or the code, we pre-bake all of your front end, we deploy it, and then we sort of flip a switch where the new deploy goes live. You get this very nice characteristic where you're never like in weird intermediary cache states where some people see something and some people say other things. And we can start giving you these instant rollback capabilities where if you want to go back to any earlier deploys, you can switch back in milliseconds. It led to, like, it really required this idea of instant cache invalidation and instant rollbacks. And it's really become like a market standard for how you should run your front end today. The other thing that still to this day, like an incredibly important part of pre-baking is security. This is just like the output from we have a small internal site at Netlify that's called Pets of Netlify, where employees upload pictures of their pets. And it's just a static site built in 11C. It hasn't been updated in a long time. Like from a software perspective, it's very simple. It's just like a list of pets, right? Like, But if you take that code and run npm audit on it, you find, what does it say here? Like, I forget the number, but like several different severe security bugs in the npm modules this simple static sites relies on, right? Like, this would be a very real problem for us if this was running dynamically on a server somewhere. But because we know that this code only runs during build time and then we just deploy the pages, there's just no security issues behind it, right? Like, if you can do this, it gives you some big benefits. However, as we look at the journey since the Jamstack got coined as a term 8 years ago and all the way to today, we've gone from this very early ecosystem of pure open source framework and seed stage companies to the first full-fledged front-end framework launched in the wake of Netlify. It was really Gatsby that sort of invented the idea of using React for the builds and React hydration as a way to mix like the static content-driven pages with single-page app functionality in return for maybe bloating the page load with some extra JavaScript. We also, after our initial launch, brought Netlify functions to the world with the idea of like giving you a way to simply run your dynamic backend for the front-end code together with the front-end just by putting it in the same Git repository. That's now become like a common part of any modern front-end cloud, and it's kind of like the way you think about the dynamic functionality. The next big sort of commercially backed framework that really took off was Next.js, that pioneered some of the concepts apart from React hydration, like choosing between static or server-side rendering on a per page basis, and introduced this idea of incremental static regeneration as a way to kind of bridge the gap between static and server-side rendering by saying, like, first time we get a request, we'll generate a static asset and then serve that. And then since that, we've had this explosion of frameworks where today these are just, I've even missed a couple here of just like commercially backed front-end frameworks like Nux, the Remixer, Astro, Hydrogen, 11t, Redwood, Solid, Svelte, Quick, and Angular would be a couple of more examples, right? Like, and we've gone towards a world where we kind of pioneered this front-end cloud concept, but it's really becoming like a general concept across many different providers now, where you have like an edge layer of very fast performing functions running close to the user, a CDN layer where you want anything you can pre-bake to live and be directly available to the browser, and then this combination of serverless functions or ISR functions as the way you generate SSR content. And we've gone from like this very first stack that kind of was the first enterprise-ready version of the Jamstack that emerged back in 2016 to this massive ecosystem of headless commerce platforms, headless content platform, search, payments, headless databases that works as APIs almost out of the box, and so many other tools in the space. Now, if we look at how the Jamstack have progressed recently and where we are at, one of the really big things that happened in the whole ecosystem was this move of React to start becoming more than just opinionated about the client side and the front end, and start introducing the idea of server components and a layer there. And if we look just at the pure sort of market share of different frameworks right now, this is from our own survey on the front-end landscape from last year. You'll see Next.js has like topped in popularity and is driving a lot of the innovation through their concept of the app router that really start blurring the lines between front-end and back-end, and maybe start pulling us a little more back to the idea of like building full stack, directly accessing databases from our front-end code and so on, but can still totally function with like an approach where you keep more strict separation between APIs and front ends. The Next has grown to be a really powerful but also very complicated framework, right? Like this is from the founder of Vercel that's building Next, mentioning just all the different rendering modes that Next supports today. And in a follow-up tweet saying like, with a lot of excitement, right? Like Next passing a promise from an React server component into a client component that hydrates the initial stage of a single page application data fetching layer like stale rivalry validate, essentially an on-the-fly ergonomic streaming API server. And kind of highlights like a little bit how we maybe have gone from an initial attempt of really thinking, how do we re-simplify from a very complicated world of layers of different caches. This is an architecture diagram from Next.js documentation on caching in Next, right? Like, and I can't help feeling that it doesn't seem that different from my old diagram of how the web had gotten a bit too complex. So in a certain way, we've kind of come full circle. The web has definitely grown back to being the most relevant development platform you can build for. And it's vibrant as ever. We've seen a lot of innovation. But we have maybe also gone to a place where building for the web is getting really complicated again. So as we look from 2024 and into the future, what can we do to bring back some of that simplicity, and where can that come from? I see two interesting paths to simplicity, and there'll be more as we go along, but two paths I've been excited about. One is to sort of go back and say, there was this initial notion of the pre-baked Jamstack, right? Like the kind of initial idea of like, the simpler we can make the idea of like, let's build out the pages, let's put them on a CDN, the simpler our architecture and the easier to reason about. Now, this is a really interesting chart from our survey last year that doesn't show absolute popularity. This showed the change in usage and the change in satisfaction score from the thousands of people we surveyed, right? Like, and one standout thing was Astro just surging in more people starting to adopt it and more people being really happy with it. And I think a lot of that excitement comes from this idea of like, hey, if you're actually building content-first websites and you're not building web applications, really complex hybrids and so on, maybe just really go back to starting with the idea of pre-building all of the pages and put them on a CDN, keep a really simple rendering mode, and then use the island architecture to keep this simplicity, but be able to say, hey, we have this page, it's mapped to some pieces of content, it's easy to put out into the world as a static page, but we also have some real-time dynamic functionality. Astro makes it really easy to define a component that's a little island of interactivity, that has a dynamic React component and gives you good primitives for having different components communicate with each other and share state and so on. It's a very simple model. We've started, like our own team is started getting excited about Astro. We recently launched developers.netlify.com that's built in Astro. Our marketing team actually also picked up Astro, and netlify.com today is built with Astro. And we've always had this principle of like, our app.netlify.com is a single page app, it's a dynamic application. Our marketing site has always been a static site. And I've often heard the argument that over time you kind of end up using both and so on. I haven't seen it be true, right? Like our marketing site has not evolved into being an application over time. And for our actual application, a single page approach has been really great and really simple to work with. So this is one way to achieve like simplicity. Let's go back to thinking about what are we actually building, and if we're building something that's fundamentally driven by a set of content, maybe just this pre-baked rendering mode is all we need. The other path to simplicity is just embracing server-side rendering without all the complication of rendering modes, right? Like, and a question like a lot of people associated Jamstack very, very strongly with static sites as the main driver. I was never one of them. I always thought, like even in the first presentation, there's a slide with the word static crossed out, right? Like I think static was an important piece of it, but it wasn't like the end goal. The decoupling was the end goal. And if you look at this diagram where we have Git and a build tool and a CDN, and we talk straight from the CDN to different APIs, if you move it to this diagram and you still talk straight to APIs, but there's a layer just behind the CDN that does SSR, to me, this is not a fundamentally different architecture. It's very different if this whole SSR layer is not just a rendering layer, but it's like a mixture of business logic and data access and all of that. Now we're in a different world. But if it's really just a rendering layer that talks to different APIs, it's very similar architecture. And as I said, like this is the slide from back in the original Jamstack talk where I was saying like this is not about static. It is about building with a decoupled architecture. So if we look at an approach to Jamstack that embraces server-side rendering, what would that look like? It would look a lot like this, right? Like so, Remix is a front-end framework that is built by the team that built React Router. They started it as a startup and then got acquired by Shopify. That I think has done a really good job. They've really taken it on as like a core open source project for web infrastructure in the same way that Shopify has been sponsors of Ruby and Rails for a long time. After they moved to Shopify, they embraced Vite as the core build and preview server and sort of really even minimized the surface area of the framework to say like we're kind of just a handler that taps into Vite and makes server-side rendering plus edge caching a simple approach. Edge caching can actually be very complicated. And we've put a lot of thoughts into at Netlify, how can we make it easy to support this approach where you render the first time, but you want our CDN to cache and to invalidate things at the right time. So we recently introduced the standards compliant Netlify CDN cache control header that makes it very easy in any Remix app to just define a little headers block and say, these caching instructions are only for Netlify. Don't send them to the user's browser, right? Like, so that was tell Netlify, cache this page for 60 seconds after the first visit, right? Like, and it won't tell the user's browser, keep this page cached for 60 seconds, which for many reasons is pretty risky because you start losing control of how to refresh a page from your customer. And this also automatically invalidates on deploy with Netlify, right? Like, so if you send this header to us, every time you do a new deploy, we'll instantly invalidate any cached content, so you never have like, so you still get this sense of atomic deploys where you don't have one page linking to an old version of the page and get into bad states. We also support this cache instruction called stale while revalidate. And if you look at this full caching header, this one basically tells Netlify, don't, like, in a way it tells a max age of 0, so it tells Netlify, don't show a cache page to the user. But then it says, you can show the stale page you have in your cache, even if it's stale, even if you technically shouldn't show it, while you revalidate the content. So this would tell Netlify that if someone visits my site, and I have a version of that site in the cache, I'll just immediately give the user that version. It'll be very fast. And then in the background, I'll do a request to the Remix server-side rendering, re-render the page, store the result in the cache, and the next time a user come in, they will get a cached response. It'll be extremely fast, and I'll keep doing that revalidation in the background, right? Like, so this is like a very efficient technique that meets a good middle ground that refreshes in the background. The user suddenly doesn't have to care how long it takes for your APIs to respond. But we also make sure to invalidate again on every deploy. So if you actually deploy a new version of your site, it'll invalidate the cache and people will not get like weird experiences of old content, new content next to each other. We also introduced the concept of cache tags to support this approach and to really say, maybe sometimes you want us to invalidate on deploy, but you might also have an API you're talking to. Let's say that you're talking to Contentful. And you might want us to invalidate when the code changes, but you also want to be able to send a message and say invalidate whenever there's an API update. And now you can do that with the cache tags. The last piece that most people forget when they're doing this approach is cache keys. This is just like a simple remix demo. It has a very specific URL, and all these caching headers can apply here. But this is what happens to that URL if I share it with a friend in Messenger. Suddenly it gets this huge like query parameter attached with a unique session to me. By default, a CDN will use the URL it's given as the cache key. So as soon as you share, like as soon as your CMO runs a really big social media campaign, you start getting this weird situation where everyone gets their own cache key. Every single visitor gets their own cache key. And all your caching is gone. So to solve that, if you're not using Netlify, you'll have to figure out how you can define cache keys up front through configurations and so on. If you're using Netlify with this approach, you can just set a Netlify vary header. In this case, we're saying like, take the query parameter and only look at the page and per page query parameters. Anything else doesn't form a part of the cache key. And now you can actually make this kind of caching work. And this really allows our full platform built for this Jamstack approach to serve this kind of server-side rendered approach. And I think it can be really powerful, and I think, again, that it can help us simplify all the different rendering motions. So just to end up with the last part of this, like since we launched this 8 years ago, Jamstack has essentially won to a point where there's almost a question of the word itself, because like every single traditional CMS is either declining in market share or they've started going headless. I can't find, like, I don't think anyone here can like really name a modern CMS that launched within the last 8 years or a modern e-commerce platform that launched within the 8 years that's been successful that wasn't headless, right? Like it's just become the way things go. But over these 8 years, it also kind of got complicated again, right? Like we went from really trying to focus on simplicity and how to make the web simple to build for, to getting pretty complicated over again. And I think it's time we start the next stage of like, how do we re-simplify? How do we get it simple again? And I see immediately like two paths, like go back and say like, there is content-driven pages. If we pre-bake them, add SSR where needed, add islands as needed, but start going back to that core concept of pre-baking, we'll get all the benefits of security, reliability, and simplicity. And on the other hand, if that approach is not a fit, instead of getting like a very complex approach where we mix every single rendering mode, let's just move to SSR and edge caching to get fast publishing, scale our content, and have some server logic that can use to show different prices per request and whatever we might need. So that's it. Thanks. Looking forward for the next 8 years.